Thank you very much, Dr. Pierce. Okay, so the title of this talk will be Shangri-La, the mythological mirage of Tibet. Like Dr. Pierce said within the intro, I'm doing research for my PhD through the University of Malaga in Spain. So just a little bit of background on me. I've studied Buddhism for about 30 years. And in that time, that has led me to be able to study in Canada, to be able to study at Naropa University, the first Buddhist university in the West, and also to spend some time studying at a Tibetan monastery in Nepal. And when it came time for me to work on my PhD, I wanted to find a way to mix in together my love of Tibet, my love of Eastern philosophy, together with the Western literary tradition on it. And I also wanted to find a way to sort of explore what it is for me as a Western person that initially drew me to have interest in Tibet, initially drew me to have interest in particular in Tibetan Buddhism. And the frame of my PhD is something called mythography. Mythography is the study of mythology with this. So we're not going to go really super in depth on mythography, but you will see a whole lot of mythological strands throughout what it is that we're talking about. So like I said, I wanted to answer the question about what it was that attracted me to it. I also wanted to answer the question of what impact has this myth of Shambhala had on the West and attracting Western people to Tibet and to Tibetan Buddhism. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term Shambhala, you soon won't be. You'll soon know a lot more about it than you probably ever wanted to know on it. Okay, so this talk is for everyone. So I assume that you have no prior knowledge of Tibet. I assume that you have no prior knowledge of Buddhism in general. So I tried to make a talk that could be as far-reaching as is possible. Also, within this talk, you're going to learn a whole lot about the history of the myth of Shambhala. You're also going to learn a whole lot about the history of Tibetan Buddhism in the West and the influences that Tibetan Buddhism has had on Western culture. So, in my research, I've found that you can basically divide the information that the West has on Tibet. You can basically divide what you see in pop culture, what you see in the literary canon, into two basic themes. These two basic themes are Tibet as a spiritual journey or wish fulfillment, and also Tibet as a magical wonderland. So with regards to Tibet as a magical wonderland, it's this kind of idea like in Alice in Wonderland. Alice goes down the rabbit hole, and whenever she comes out on the other side, it's this mythical, magical land full of all sorts of things that she has never seen before. So it's this sort of idea of Tibet as this mythical place, this idea that we build up this idea of Tibet based upon a whole lot of our Western fantasies and our Western imaginative mind. And Tibet's spiritual journey is a whole lot having to deal with texts whose main focus is that the protagonist goes through some sort of a spiritual journey and comes out with some form of awakening on the other side of it as a result of mixing together with Tibetan culture and or a lama. So, to begin off, Tibet. Where is Tibet? So Tibet is located right here. So you see its neighbor to the south is India, and its neighbor over here to the north, right here you would have Russia. And over here you would have China. And Tibet shares Mount Everest together with Nepal. So Mount Everest is located about halfway between Tibet and halfway between Nepal. And Tibet is about twice the size of Texas. it's huge. And it's traditionally said that Tibet had around 6 to 8 million people. And a lot of the information that we're covering on this part of it would be Tibet pre-Chinese Communist invasion on it. So that is what is traditionally considered Tibet. And there's also this idea of something called Greater Tibet. So Greater Tibet would be areas that Tibetan culture has deeply influenced. So these would be areas in Nepal, areas in northern India. For example, Darjeeling. You might have heard of Darjeeling. You might have drinking some Darjeeling tea. Darjeeling is actually a Tibetan word. Darji is the Tibetan word dorje, and ling is the word for a place. So Darjeeling is the place of the thunderbolt. There's this really cool myth about a Tibetan saint named Guru Rinpoche who went to Darjeeling. So around Darjeeling, around Bhutan, and also in Mongolia. Mongolia shares a similar Tibetan Buddhist culture, as does Tibet. And also, one of the important things to know about Tibet is also it's geographically cut off from the rest of the world. So the Tibetan Plateau is the highest land on Earth. So you have the Himalaya mountains right here, and you have the Kundun mountains right here. And it's said that it took approximately 6 to 8 months if you wanted to travel from the capital of Tibet in Lhasa to the capital of China in Beijing. So Tibet for centuries and centuries was cut off from the rest of the world geographically and also politically. Tibet wanted to cut itself off from its neighbors in order to preserve its culture. And you'll also see a little bit more about Tibet and its neighbors whenever we get on to the subject of the great game in Rudyard Kipling's Kim. So one of the important features about Tibet is Tibetan Buddhism, or Vajrayana Buddhism. So within Tibetan Buddhism, you have 4 major lineages, or 4 major schools of thought. You can kind of think about these schools as being, each one of them has the exact same focus and the fact that they all are there to help their adherents to achieve enlightenment. The purpose of Tibetan Buddhism is to help for individuals to achieve enlightenment for themselves and for others. So within Tibetan Buddhism, all of the schools have the same goal, and all of the schools have the same potential for their adherents to be able to achieve enlightenment. But there are differences within them. And a nice way to think about it is like salsa. I usually think about it like salsa. So each one of these schools has their own meditation techniques, which is kind of like your salsa. Your grandma's got her salsa. That salsa that she had was passed down from her grandma, that was passed down from her grandma. You have this secret family recipe. My family might put cumin in the salsa. Somebody else's family might put honey in the salsa. So it's the same way each one of the Tibetan Buddhist lineages have their own meditation techniques that are going to be slightly different than the other ones. And so there's 4 major lineages. So there's His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who most of you probably recognize. And he's from the Gelugpa lineage. And there's His Holiness Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche. He's from the Nyingma lineage. There is His Holiness Sakya Trinzen. He's from the Sakya tradition. And then there's His Holiness the Karmapa. He's from the Kagyu tradition. And another identifying characteristic of Tibetan Buddhism is something called the Tolku tradition. So Tolku is a Tibetan word for the Sanskrit word Nirmanakaya, which is also closely related with the Sanskrit word avatar. So for those of you who might have seen Avatar, The Last Airbender, there's most definitely a connection there between this and that. So the Tolku tradition goes, we'll just use the Dalai Lama as an example. So the Tolku tradition goes, His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama lived in Tibet and he died. So while he was alive, he had lots of students. He taught meditation to these students. He had a certain set of literature that he shared amongst his followers. And so what happened was His Holiness the 13th Dalai Lama passed away. And then his particular followers wanted to track down his reincarnation. So it's this idea that His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is seen as being the reincarnation of the 13th Dalai Lama. So the way that it works is you will have a master, he will have disciples, or she will have disciples. And they train these disciples, and then once this master passes away, it's the job of those disciples to find that master again. And then the disciples then become the masters in training up the young Tulku, or the young incarnate Lama. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama is seen as being the 14th incarnation of the Dalai Lama Tulku lineage. And this lineage actually began with the Karmapas. So we are actually on the 17th Karmapa. So that's a little bit of background. That's a little bit of sort of Tibetan Buddhism in a nutshell, Tibetan culture in a nutshell with it. So now what I want to do is I want to look at this myth of Shambhala. And I want to look at how it has affected Western literature and the Western canon by looking at these different texts. But first, we need to know, what is Shambhala? Please raise your hand if you've heard the word Shambhala before. A few people have. Okay. Please raise your hand if you've heard the word Shangri-La before. Okay. A majority of people have heard of this word Shangri-La. This, spoilers, this word Shangri-La comes from Shambhala. So, Shambhala. Shambhala is a traditional Tibetan myth. The story goes about 2,550 years ago. The Buddha Shakyamuni, the historical Buddha, or the Buddha that was Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha was teaching in India. And there was a man who came to him from the kingdom of Shambhala. And the kingdom of Shambhala was said to be located north of India and north of Tibet. So this man's name was Dawa Zangpo, or Dawa Sangpo. He came to the Buddha and he requested that the Buddha give him a special type of teachings. He was a king. He had duties to his, the people in his kingdom. He had duties to his family. He wanted to be able to practice Buddhism, but he didn't want to have to become a monk to do it. So it said that the Buddha gave Dawa Zangpo a very special set of teachings for him to be able to practice. And you see Shakyamuni gave advanced tantric teachings to the first king of Shambhala, Dawa Zangpo. And these sets of teachings are called the Kala Chakra. Kala Chakra means wheel of time. So this is really the origin of the Shambhala myth. So what happened was Dawa Zangpo went back to Shambhala, and it said that Dawa Zangpo brought these teachings with him to Shambhala. And this is the traditional representation of Shambhala. So this is a traditional Tibetan tanka, or a traditional Tibetan painting of Shambhala. So you see that it looks like two circles. There, on the outside, there's one circle of snow mountains, and then there's 8 principalities, or 8 areas. And on the inside of it, there's another circle of snow mountains, and then there's the capital of Shambhala, Kalapa, where the king of Shambhala lives. So it said that the kingdom of Shambhala looks like this. So this is the traditional representation. The first time I saw it, I thought, that reminds me of Atlantis. It reminds me of this circles within circles idea. So the story goes is that Dawa Zangpo began practicing the Kala Chakra there. And the story goes is that he achieved a very high level of realization, and then his followers became interested in practicing the Kala Chakra. So the idea goes that at a certain point, everybody in the kingdom was practicing this very special meditation technique, this very special form of Buddhism. And the story goes that at a certain point, Shambhala disappeared from the earth many centuries ago, and at a certain point, the entire society had become enlightened, and the kingdom vanished into another, more celestial realm. So this is some pretty unusual stuff. We don't usually think about these things. This is very Tibetan. This is a very cool myth. So the idea goes that you have Shambhala is a Be-yul. Be is hidden, and Yul is land. So it's this idea that high up north of Tibet, there's this hidden land. There's this place where if an average person goes there, all they see is snow mountains. But if you're a person with the right karma, if you go there, you're going to see the buildings of Shambhala, you're going to see the people of Shambhala, you're going to see this whole particular land of Shambhala. So the Shambhala myth has two main aspects to it. The first aspect is the hidden valley. The second aspect is the Shambhala prophecy. So this says that at some time in the future, the world will be in a really bad state. That materialism will run rampant, that things will just be really, really, really bad. And according to the story, at that point, the king of Shambhala will come out from Shambhala and he'll reveal the kingdom to everyone. And then he'll help to spread peace and harmony throughout the entire world. So this story has two different angles. The first angle is hidden kingdom. The second angle is Shambhala prophecy within it. And there's lots of major Tibetan texts that talk about this. And there's lots of really cool folk stories you'll read about old people who happen to have come upon the kingdom and who never wanted to go, but they decided they would leave to go get their family, and then they came back and it wasn't there. So these really cool kind of stories like this. So there is something extra special about this myth. There's something extra special about this idea that out there somewhere, there's a place where people got it right. Out there somewhere, there's a utopian society. There's a place where people live in peace, where people live in kindness, where people are considerate of their neighbors. There's something extraordinarily special about this. In the West, we've always sort of had a love for this idea of an enlightened society. Even dating back to the time of Plato's Republic, we've always sort of wanted that. We've always sort of sought that idea out there. And right around the 1850s, the world was getting smaller and smaller. At that time, a lot of the blank spots on the map were starting to be filled up. So a lot of the areas that were unexplored had become explored, but Tibet was one of these last places that had not been explored. Like I said previously, Tibet was cut off geographically and politically cut off from the rest of the world. So during this time, Tibet had this reputation as an unreachable land, as a land of the god king, the forbidden land that nobody could go to. So in this void of knowledge, people started to make up stories about Tibet. People started to make up stories that in Tibet there were mystical, magical lamas who could fly, and there were all sorts of unusual things happening there. And for your average person, it would be, if anything like that were to be able to happen anywhere, it might be happening in Tibet. We don't know what's happening in Tibet. And at this time, in the mid-1800s, Western people also began looking towards the East for spiritual inspiration. They began looking towards the East. A lot of early Buddhist texts were starting to be translated in British India, and a lot of Hindu texts were starting to be translated in British India. So there was an interest in looking towards the East. Books like The Light of Asia were becoming popular in the British public. So there was an interest in looking towards the East for spirituality, but there was also an interest in looking for alternative forms of spirituality in the West, such as spiritualism and theosophy. I'm only briefly going to touch on spiritualism. I was talking with Dr. Pierce, I could spend a whole afternoon talking about spiritualism. In a nutshell, spiritualism is not spirituality. So you might be saying like, oh yeah, my aunt's a spiritualist. You know, she does some yoga. She's interested in these sort of things. My aunt, she has had her chakras read. Your aunt may be spiritual. Your aunt may be into spirituality, but chances are your aunt's probably not a spiritualist. So spiritualism was a religious movement that was started in 1848 by Margaret and Kate Fox, the Fox sisters. So spiritualism really spread across the USA, in particular after the American Civil War. It spread throughout England, it spread throughout Europe. It's basically this belief that there is an afterlife, people die, and that we can communicate with people in the afterlife by going to a psychic, by going to a seance, by going to some form of a medium. And this movement really, really caught on like wildfire. In the mid to late 1800s, you started to see a tremendous amount of spiritualist movements around the US. Different people like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes, was deeply, deeply involved with spiritualism, as was Mary Todd Lincoln. And so spiritualism began around this time. So people started to look for alternative forms of spirituality within the West. One of the alternative forms was something called theosophy. So theosophy was a movement that was started by a Russian noblewoman by the name of Helena Blavatsky, or she liked to call herself Madame Blavatsky. So Madame Blavatsky was born in Russia. Her grandmother was a princess, and her first cousin was Sergei Witt, who later on went to become the imperial prime minister of Russia. So she came from this noble background, from this noble Russian background. And she claimed that as a small child that she saw spirits. She claimed as a small child to be a very in tune with the next world. So Blavatsky started off as a spiritualist, and she came to the United States in order to research more our spiritual movement here. And when she got here, she met a gentleman by the name of Henry Alcott. Henry Alcott was one of the prime people in charge of learning about the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. He was a big to-do guy. He had a really good public reputation. So Henry Alcott and Madame Blavatsky got together and they formed something called the Theosophical Society. And the purpose of the Theosophical Society was to promote brotherhood or sisterhood amongst men and women, and to also study Eastern philosophical texts and Western philosophical texts and what they would call occult literature within this. And they also wanted to study psychic phenomenon as well, which was a really big thing to do at that time. So she founded something called the Theosophical Society. So here's where we wrap it around back to Tibet. When you're talking about Blavatsky, one of the things is it's hard to tell what's true and what's not true with her. So with it, I've had many conversations with many people about it. For me, whenever I approached her as a researcher, it's better for me not to pass judgment on whatever she did was true and whatever she did that wasn't true within it. So it's better for me to look at it as what impact did she have on society? What impact did she have on the people around her So that's sort of the angle that I come at Blavatsky with. Also, I was telling Dr. Pierce, I had a conversation with one of the people at the Theosophical Institute. He was uncertain about what she did, whether it was true or not. But he also agrees the major thing is the impact that she had. So Blavatsky, her biggest impact in the West is the publication of a book called The Secret Doctrine. So Blavatsky says that she, prior to coming to the US, that she lived in Tibet for 7 years. She says that she lived at Tashi Lumpo Monastery, which you can see right here, and that she, while she was at the monastery, that she was shown a secret book, and that this book was called the Book of Dhyan, and that this book was written in a secret language called Sinsar, and she was taught how to read this secret language. And when Blavatsky came back to the West, she wrote down this wisdom tradition that she says that she learned in Tibet in this book called The Secret Doctrine. And this book was basically one really long poem that she took and dissected apart. So you have the root text and then you have commentary based upon that. So Blavatsky gives you a poem and she gives you a bunch of commentary about it afterwards. So Blavatsky also said that this book had its origins in Shambhala. Blavatsky said that this book came from Shambhala, and Blavatsky also says that Shambhala is the sort of spiritual hub of the universe. And Blavatsky also said that she had direct psychic links with people called the Mahatmas, who lived in Tibet or who lived in northern India. So she claimed to be, much like a spiritualist, one of these psychic people who could connect with this. And her movement really, really, really took off. There were lots of people who were very interested in it. They were either interested in it for, I want to learn more about Eastern philosophy, or they might have been interested in it because it was a place where she treated everyone equally. Men could join her thing, women could join her thing, everyone could join her group. And there was this idea of coming about and of studying different texts from different places. And Blavatsky did a whole lot of really good things. And the fact that she really promoted people beginning to look towards the East and people beginning to look for different ways of spirituality. Blavatsky was very influential. She had an influence on Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Although Conan Doyle was not a theosophist, she had an influence on Nicholas and Helena Roerich. They were a Russian couple who went to Tibet specifically looking for Shambhala. They made a large trip to Tibet, actually on the US dime, looking for Tibet. And also other people like H.P. Lovecraft. You can see references to Roerich. He mentions Roerich 7 times in The Mountains of Madness, and also W.Y. Evan Wentz, who was the first person to translate the Tibetan Book of the Dead into English. She had a very, very large reaching influence. And so The Secret Doctrine was the first big thing. The next big thing was Sherlock Holmes. So we had mentioned before that Conan Doyle had an interest in spiritualism. He had an interest in theosophy. Conan Doyle also was probably the most popular author alive in his day. In the late 1800s, everybody read everything that Conan Doyle wrote. It was super, super, super popular. His Sherlock Holmes still is, I think I read that it's the most remade movie of all time. There's so many different iterations of it. I mean, there's even Wishbone versions of it, for those of you who are old enough to remember that. So at a certain point, Conan Doyle he got tired of Sherlock. He wanted to be taken more seriously. So he killed off Sherlock. Yeah, I know, exactly. He killed off Sherlock at the Reichenbach Falls. The story goes is that Moriarty and Sherlock met at the Reichenbach Falls. They got in a fight and they fell off into the falls, and they both died. And so rumor has it Conan Doyle wanted to keep it like that. And then about 2 years later, he got tired of people asking him, when are you going to bring Sherlock back? They also threw a ton of money at him. That could be one of the reasons. So Conan Doyle decided, I'll bring Sherlock back. And he brought Sherlock back in the story called The Adventure of the Empty House. So Sherlock comes back. And so we need to say, okay, well, where was Sherlock during this time? Where was Sherlock at? So Sherlock tells Watson that I traveled for 2 years in Tibet, and I amused myself by visiting Lhasa and spending some days with the head Lama. So Sherlock wants to place himself in the most mysterious place of all for many people at that point. Conan Doyle knew this reputation that Tibet had. Conan Doyle wanted to sort of add his own story to that larger story that was happening in society at the time. And the next big one was Rudyard Kipling. So who's seen The Jungle Book or read The Jungle Book? The Jungle Book is pretty popular. That's Rudyard Kipling's probably most popular work. Kipling is also very famous for this book called Kim. So Kim came out between 1900 and 1901. So the story of Kim is a story about a young British boy named Kimball O'Hara. And Kimball O'Hara befriends a Tibetan Lama named the Teshu Lama. And the Teshu Lama came down from Tibet to India to be able to search for a magical river that he hoped to be able to attain enlightenment with. And this is the first case in Western literature of a fully developed Tibetan character. So Kipling gave him a name, Kipling gave him a backstory. Kipling named him in the book the Tesho Lama. And it's interesting, a lot of British people would refer to, there's a certain Lama in Tibet called the Tashi Lama. So the Dalai Lama is the head of the Gelugpa lineage, and the second highest Lama in the Gelugpa lineage was a Lama called the Panchen Lama, and some Tibetans referred to him as the Tashi Lama. And some British people, whenever they heard that, they thought that they were saying the Teshu Lama. So there are some places where you see the Panchen Lama referred to as the Teshu Lama. So I think Kipling was just giving a little hat nod to that. I don't think that he was meaning that this was really the Panchen Lama who came down from Tibet. So this story goes, in this book, it's kind of a boy on his own adventure, to where Kimball O'Hara has a lot of freedom to be able to do whatever he wants. He's an orphan, and he meets up with this Tibetan Lama, and he becomes just fascinated by this Lama. He thinks that this Lama is a very good, sincere person, that there's something sort of amazing about this Lama's humbleness. So Kim then becomes he says Chela. So he then becomes the assistant, or like kind of the servant to this Lama. He wants to help this Lama to be able to find his holy river. And through a set of circumstances in the story, Kim then has to spend time in a British school there. And the Lama encourages him, you need to know the ways of your people, you need to get an education. Education is very important. And through a set of circumstances, he joins a British school there, and he starts training as what they called a line man. So it's this idea of being a British spy. So in the book, he gets training to be a British spy so that he can go and spy on the area in northern India. So let's go back just a little bit. So whenever we were right here, So I said India is right here, Tibet is right here, Russia is right here. In the book, so Kim takes place down here. And in the book, you see all of the different major characters of what was called the Great Game. So the Great Game is a political movement in Central Asia around the early 1900s and late 1800s. So it was this idea that you have British India, Imperial India. You also have Imperial Russia located up north. So this would have been Tsar Nicholas, Imperial Russia. And so there was a fight, a subtle underground fight for who would have control of Central Asia. So a lot of Kim is revolving around trying to train this young boy so that he can be a spy, so that he can go up and find out what's happening with Russia in this area. And so you see in the book, you see the major characters in play. So you see the Tibetan Lama, you see Russians up in the mountains, you see lots of British folks. You don't necessarily see the Chinese within it, but you see this idea, it's set against a backdrop of a real political situation here. And it's also worth noting, so Kipling's Kim came out in 1901. So it was at the height of that time whenever the British were starting to have very real concerns that the Russians might be trying to take over Central Asia, in particular take over Tibet. There was a military expedition that went into Tibet that was led by Francis Younghusband to try to see were there indeed Russians in Tibet. There was some rumors going around that the Russians had infiltrated Tibet and that they were trying to convince the Dalai Lama that Russia was the land of Shambhala. So, which is all just made up. There really wasn't this. They was trying to convince them that Russia was the land of Shambhala. So according to the British, they needed to see what was happening there. So the British went there, they looked around, oh, no Russians here, and then they went back. So that's Rudyard Kipling's Kim. And the Tibetan Lama character in this, the Tesho Lama, is extremely likable. There's something special about the way that he was written that your average person reading it really sort of fell in love with him. And even the man who led the British expedition into Tibet, Francis Younghusband, when he went to Tibet, he was on the lookout for people who reminded him of the Tesho Lama. You can read in his diaries that he said that he met the regent of Tibet at the time, and he said that this man reminds me the most of Kipling's Lama of anyone I've ever met. So there was a really sort of special connection in the British and in the Western mind, connecting real Tibetans with this story. The next big thing, and probably the biggest one of all, is Lost Horizon. Lost Horizon came out in 1933, and it was a novel by James Hilton, who was famous for his book, Goodbye, Mr. Chips. And it was a 1937 film, and there's a little excerpt from the film by Frank Capra. Frank Capra was famous for It's a Wonderful Life. So, the story of Lost Horizon is that there was a plane wreck on the corner of Tibet. There was a gentleman by the name of Conway who was escaping a city that in China that had been taken over. He was on a plane, and there was a plane wreck right in the Kundun Mountains in Tibet. And he was rescued, the main character Conway, and the other people on the plane were rescued by the inhabitants of the Valley of the Blue Moon. And in particular, by the inhabitants of the monastery there that's called Shangri-La. So this book right here is where we get the word Shangri-La from. This book right here was really, really, really popular whenever it came out. Even after it came out, FDR named, the original name for Camp David was Shangri-La. They named it after the monastery in the book. So in this story right here, this is very much the Shambhala story, but told for a different people in a different time and place. So you have all the aspects of the Shambhala story. So you have a kingdom. So the monastery of Shangri-La is located in a valley surrounded by snow mountains, and it's headed up by a guy they call the head lama. And this head lama is supposed to have these kind of magical powers within this. And everybody that lives in the valley lives in perfect peace and harmony. And so you see this valley, you see this experience of this valley through Conway, the main protagonist in this. So you get to see what he thinks of this valley, what he thinks of these people. And there's also kind of this element of wish fulfillment within it. At a time whenever the world was really bad, sort of imagining what would it be like to be able to go to this sort of peaceful valley, to be able to go to this place where everybody gets along. So this has that aspect of it. It has the Bayul, the hidden valley. This also has the aspect of the Shambhala prophecy in it. So in the story, it goes that whenever Conway is in Shangri-La, he also learns that the inhabitants of Shangri-La get stuff in a very clever way where nobody knows that they get it in, stuff from the outside world. So the inhabitants of Shangri-La are bringing in items from the outside world, such as music, such as statues, such as works of literature. They're bringing in what they consider to be the best of the outside world, for fear that at one point in the outside world that man will destroy, or mankind will destroy itself in war, so that Shangri-La can be sort of this last bastion where it can go out, and once the wars are over, it can go out to the rest of the world and sort of reculture the rest of the world, bring about all that was peaceful and kind back out to the rest of the world with it. So this particular story actually has both aspects of the Shangri-La myth to it, the Shambhala myth. And a lot of days I will use these terms sort of interchangeably. I think that one of them is most definitely Tibetan, but if you say Shambhala to the average person, they don't know. If you say Shangri-La, they usually know what that is. And the next big one is this book called The Third Eye.